There are many, many theories as to why this case came out the way it did, and there's probably an element of truth in all of them. But the thing I want to focus on, mainly on this, is the idea of the DA's office not really understanding the physical evidence. They focused on DNA, and there were many other things in the case that, that they left unattended, and I think that created several problems. You'll see what I'm getting at in a minute. Some of the trace evidence was trace evidence from the outset of the case, and some of it was trace evidence that was created in terms of issues that were raised by the defense. So the defense created trace evidence issues that didn't previously exist, and you'll see what that's all about. And basically, they involve this idea of evidence planting. I was retained by the LA DA's office about the time the trial was starting, not in the preparation stages. And the first thing I told them when I went out to LA was that this was not a DNA case, that the DNA was going to be unassailable, and this really should be viewed as a evidence planting case to prepare for that. And that was not really attended to very well at all. Let me go to our first slide here. Okay, Greg is going to do the major part of this today. Greg, at that time, was assistant director of the laboratory. He's now the director, and if you were around on Monday afternoon, Greg gave a really good talk on a pilot program he's putting in and evaluating about getting his people to crime scenes and that kind of thing. Really neat. And then Hal Dedman is going to be sitting in here for Doug Dietrich. I'm one bullet point off here. Doug was the one that did the fiber work and hair work in the case, and there was a considerable amount of hair and fiber evidence. It was good evidence. The fibers were, as Hal will explain, were pretty significant kinds of fibers. And then Judge Woody Clark is going to come in at the end and talk about some of the issues that admissibility and contamination and that kind of thing. And maybe I should explain that although it's there in the bullet point, but Judge Clark was a DA in San Diego at the time, and he was loaned to the LA DA's office, as was another DA from up north in Alameda County, Rock Harmon. They were loaned to the LA DA's office, and there were many, many hours when the three of us sat in a little back room in the war room in the LA DA's office and didn't get much done. Would you agree with that, Woody? That's it. Our time was not utilized well. Okay. Okay, we all, I think, begin to recognize now that DNA answers the who question, but there are many, many questions, other interrogatives here that are not addressed by DNA normally, and this is where trace evidence really shines, and we need to make that clear to people that if they're not looking at these other questions, they're basically, doing things with a hand tied behind their backs. Okay, I'll let you read those bullet points. But before I turn this over to Greg, I would like to make another point here about the way in which this thing was handled. For example, I was brought into the case, as I indicated, as the trial was beginning, but nobody ever consulted Greg, who was really the case manager for the case for LAPD, and the DA sort of did their own things. They prepared some videos of using lab people and stuff that kind of backfired, and a number of things that were done there that weren't done in consultation with Greg and the lab. And there were other experts that were brought in as well that were hired without that kind of consultation. So anyway, it makes the point, I think, that there needs to be a good cooperation between the laboratory, the forensic science operation, and the prosecutor's office, and there needs to be an understanding and a respect for what the laboratory can contribute, and coordination and that kind of thing. Another thing that happened there that should have not have happened was that the defense had access to the evidence in its original wrappers before the laboratory had a chance to even examine it. This was a particularly a pernicious kind of thing in the case of the socks that you'll see later on. So the defense experts, and they weren't criminalists, these were pathologists, were opening up the evidence envelopes, pulling things out, looking at them this way and that way, shaking off blood flakes and redistributing stains and that kind of thing to no real purpose. And so we need to also make sure that we make the prosecutors aware that simply opening a seal on an envelope can have consequences, and that the evidence should be examined in the laboratory first. And I'm the first to champion the right of defense experts to examine the evidence, but it shouldn't be done in that way. Maybe it could be done simultaneously, but at least the first opening of the thing should be done in the laboratory and not in some ante-room, and it should be done by the laboratory people and well documented and so forth. And I'll leave this up for a second here. I used this on Monday. I think it's an important thing. There's a lot of evidence here, a lot of evidence in this case. And it might be a useful exercise to think about what would have been done with this case when I started in the field in 1960. We did ABO typing. That was it. And I think that this case wouldn't have been a problem. It was this sort of misplaced focus on the DNA. I mean, you think about it, you've got a crime scene with two bodies, you've got blood spatter, you've got a trail leading away from the bodies with size 15 expensive Bruno Magli shoes. Nothing individual about the marks, but certainly they were good enough to, the shoes are fairly new, so they didn't have individual characteristics. A drop trail beside that trail, knowledge later that the defendant had a cut finger on the left hand. The glove that would have been covering that hand was left at that scene. The other glove was at the residence. From that trail leading out to a place where a car would be parked, they then go to I guess the sequence of where they went is not too important here, but the next thing in the sequence of the reconstruction would be finding the defendant's Bronco parked in front of his home with blood on the door handle, a bloody shoe print where your clutch foot would be if you were driving a stick shift, blood smeared all over the console that was between the two front seats, and then blood leading up the driveway, up the walkway, into the foyer of the house, and then later on presumptive results found in the master bedroom shower drain and basin drain there. That raises a whole other question about admissibility of presumptive tests, and I think in this case one could make an argument that it would have been appropriate, but although it wasn't admitted, because of the continuing story it tells. But in any case, let me get off the soapbox here. I'm getting a lag here of some kind. I don't know what Okay, so Greg?
Thank you. Good morning. Boy, everybody getting up early after last night. That's great. Actually, this presentation is going to be an awful lot like, in some respects, like the case was. Like Peter mentioned, there was a lot of involvement by the DA's office, specifically in the handling of the case, and you'd think that given my involvement in it and my position in the laboratory at the time that I might be the person up here that would know the most about the case, when in reality I probably know the least about some of the specifics that went on. When the crime first occurred, actually I was supervisor of our serology unit at the time. I was a working supervisor, and amazingly enough, this case was the last case that I actually did an analysis on. I did conventional ABO typing and a few enzymes on some of the key blood stains. And that was actually the evidence that was taken through the prelim. Prelim went fairly smoothly, met regularly with Marcia Clark, who was the head DA on the case at the time. And it went like one would expect most cases to go at that point. I went fairly quickly, held to answer, a lot of hearings and things going up to it, but at that point didn't seem terribly different than any other case that we'd have. Obviously, it got an awful lot of attention. I got to say, from my standpoint, from our laboratory standpoint, we didn't have a clue where this thing was heading when it first started. We were completely unprepared for the kind of attention and the circus that ended up becoming this trial. So we went into the preliminary hearing. He was held to answer, and that was probably the last time I met directly with the head DA in this case. Trial went on for, 9 months after it got going, and we were basically cut out at that point from a lot of what occurred, a lot of the decisions as to what evidence to put forward, what evidence was going to be used in the trial, and like Peter said, an awful lot of tests and things and demonstrations that ended up going awry. There was just a lot of confusion associated with the trial at that point, and we were just responding to their needs. The whole time trying to stay on top of the rest of the cases. Amazingly enough, there were a few other homicides and sexual assaults that occurred in the city of LA in 1994 or 1995. And personally, I think one of the greatest crimes that, the crimes that occurred in this is a lot of other cases were shortcut. Things didn't happen on other cases and other victims and other suspects that should have occurred while we were spending all of our time chasing the, pretty much the biology in this case. As you all know, I mean, our laboratory did collection at the scene. We did some of the initial analysis, but after the prelim, after things started kind of exploding as far as both the attention and the complexity, or the created complexity of this case, things started being taken away from us. At one point, because as they first started talking about the potential of the planting, when that started coming up, the DA's initial reaction was take all the DNA away and send it to other laboratories. Send it to as many laboratories as possible and see if they all get the right answer or the same answer. At that point, our laboratory wasn't doing RFLP. We were doing DQ alpha, polymarker, or I forget if we were doing, no, just DQ alpha at that point, right? See, Woody was the DA that handled a lot of our DNA work, so he was more on hand on that. The experts were brought in by the prosecution, some much better than others. I was thrilled to have Peter DeForest involved, or not so thrilled to have a couple of the other ones that showed up. We did have one other expert that was brought in by the prosecution. It was an interesting experience dealing with him. I had all sorts of interesting theories. Finally, and luckily, the DA's office caught on that this isn't somebody they wanted to put on the stand, so he kind of disappeared. But over our objections, there are certain people we just don't want to be getting the advice from, but a lot of what was happening was not coming from us. So pretty much when it comes to our involvement and what occurred between the DA's office, there was a lot of confusion. But we want to touch on what, like Peter was saying, is some of the more trace issues going on here. And I'm going to be passing it off in a little while. But a couple of the things, or one of the things definitely I wanted to mention is as far as we were concerned, all the evidence in this case, and people would come up to me and they'd ask me whether or not I thought Simpson was guilty. I'd never answer that question. I don't think it's our job as a criminalist to answer a question whether or not somebody is guilty. However, if you look at the crime scene, my answer always was to people when they asked that question, all the evidence at the scene has two victims, two people that were killed, and there was one other person that was at that scene, the person that did the killing, and I'm firmly convinced that that person was Mr. Simpson. So you can decide whether or not he was guilty from that. But that's looking at the evidence. Everything pointed to one individual being present. That one individual was identified through the DNA, actually through conventional typing. I was thrilled when I got a percentage of the population. It was like 1 in 250 people could have left that blood. I mean, in conventional serology, that's just about as good as it got most of the time. But I was firmly convinced that we had one party there. Well, one of the things, and these are Peter's slides, and let's see if we can, there obviously was a lot of changes of things that occurred to the scene. This is a general layout of the Bundy crime scene. A little reminder, the bodies are located out in the front area by the street and the front door. Ron Goldman's, you can see the arrow there. Nicole Simpson Brown on the steps. Trail that led away towards the back of the property, the way the arrow goes. A variety of the footwear, blood stains and droplet stains that continued away. One of the things that I found particularly, okay. Oh, hat and glove, left glove were left out near the bodies. You can see a very, very bloody crime scene. Some of the important areas that ended up being, actually, and Peter can explain it a little bit better, on the envelope here, there was a blood stain that typed back to the suspect in this case, but it became a contention as to when and how that stain arrived at that location. Defense's explanation was that we added it later on. There's proof in the pictures that that wasn't the case. But this is some of the trails. You can see the shoe prints that were leading away. Nicely circled in case you missed them before. This was kind of an interesting thing, and having been out, I mean, I used to go on a lot of crime scenes in my earlier part of my career, and what was immediately apparent in this one is you had extremely bloody scene out front, a very nice set of shoe prints that led away from it, but at one point where there was some hesitation, I could just picture, I mean, the whole thing is indicated by somebody that isn't used to doing crime scenes. Having been to a number of homicides, you can get a feel as to whether or not this person's done it before, or whether they had a good idea what they were doing. This person didn't seem to. They obviously left something at the scene, got about halfway up the walk, and you can just see them, you know, by the prints doing this, going, oh crap, I lost a glove. Do I go back and get it? No, there's a couple bodies back there. Do I turn back? So there was a lot of indications that this was somebody that had not been involved before. You know, obviously no booties on the people that were there. Wasn't something that we did very often at the time. We've changed a lot of those procedures. But the defense capitalized on all of those items. Yeah. What was interesting too, I mean, talking along that line is and like was mentioned before, even some of the people that we would have expected to have done a better job of handling the evidence, basically handled it the same way we did. I mean, there was a lot of, we were being accused of not changing gloves a lot. They weren't changing their gloves. It just didn't matter. I mean, we were the source of all evil when it came to this. The bloody shoe prints, this is out towards the gate. I got to say that some evidence was missed. There's blood stains on that back gate that were noticed at the time, but weren't collected. They weren't picked up until a couple weeks later, I think, something like that. And ended up coming back typing to the suspect in the case. The Rockingham crime scene. I mean, there's just a whole lot of evidence to go along with this. And actually, I probably should have pointed it out when we were back on Bundy. You can see all the blood trail that occurred there in the glove. And this was all, I mean, everybody knew about all this stuff. So it's just a reminder of what's there. I'm back at Bundy. And do you have any more of the slides that go back to the...
It's been truncated a lot, and all the gory stuff is taken out, but so we're through with Bundy as far as...
Oh, okay. Well...
except for the ones that detail the envelope.
Oh, okay. And we got a lot to cover, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but excuse me. One of the issues I mentioned was the defense made a big deal out of the fact that how did we know somebody else wasn't there? I mean, you know, obviously maybe somebody was there, didn't leave any evidence of themselves. Kind of hard to believe that there was another person there and they didn't get blood on their shoes and leave other shoe prints. Well, that was one of the contentions of the defense, was that there were probably, possibly, however terms you want to use, shoe prints present at the scene that were left by another party, not the person who bled on the scene or the suspect in this case. The reality is we were able to show almost a year later that a number of the reported shoe prints that were on Bundy in the walkway going back actually were in the concrete. It's like somebody had walked in it just before it had hardened, and the cement had hardened, leaving a very faint shoe print in it. A little bit of blood on it from the scene. It looked like it could have been. When you cleaned it off, though, with oblique lighting, a year later they were still there because they were actually in the cement. Yeah, very concrete evidence, right. Very good, Pete. Actually, do you want to talk about the gloves? Because I'm not... well, actually, before I do that, one of the things, I mean, you all have done, I'm assuming, crime scenes. You see the evidence that comes into the laboratory. You'll get a box or a bag or something that has an evidence seal on it. By the time we got about a third of the way through this case, you couldn't see the seals for the seals that were on top of it from the seals that were on top of that, places that it was cut through. We went through all the evidence, sealed it back up again. At one point, it was given out to the defense. We lost completely control of it at that point. It was given back to us, sometimes not all there. But it became very confusing because the packaging itself started deteriorating over time with all the handling that was going on. I mean, you go into a paper bag 300 or 400 times, it's going to start losing some of its strength. Holes opened up on the bottom. Some of the evidence actually was slipping out. The glasses that were in that envelope that were found right at the scene at Ron Goldman's feet, one of the lenses ended up getting popped out and disappearing. I contend it occurred while it was out of our control, but nobody will ever know. We were never able to find it. But the defense had full access to this evidence almost immediately. And it's just, it's one of those situations, I'm not really even sure to this day how to do it except to throw a lot more resources at it. It was so complicated that a lot of people got involved, but as soon as a lot of people got involved, it became more complicated. So if you could have limited the number of people that were actually involved in handling all the evidence on either side, we would have been in a whole lot better shape. All right, just a sideline on that. We had the defense attorneys in our laboratory one day, and they were checking things out and wanted to make copies of a number of the reports. And one of the defense attorneys was using our copy machine and dropped the binder that was in, scattering the notes all over the place. And we got them all together. He finished his photocopying. And then about a week later, I was in court, and we were being accused of not supplying him with everything because one of his pages was missing. Well, the reality is it was missing because he messed them up, and it's just those are some of the things we were dealing with. So on the gloves, or the socks, did you want to? Why
don't we have Hal do the fiber evidence?
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, because there was a lot of evidence, and maybe they'll go into it, that actually ended up not getting presented, like the issue I was talking about before with the shoe prints that we, that supposedly indicated a second person, and we're still there a year later. The DA's office made a decision not to use that. We were never able to present that to the jury to show that the defense was making claims that couldn't be supported by the evidence.